I've just always been so enamored by the capacity for anything really, but especially human beings to truly transform. It's like if we take an acorn seed that looks nothing, resembles nothing like a tree, and yet somehow the intelligence of the universe, when the proper nutrients are provided, this small thing turns into this huge, magnificent being. And the power that's weaving underneath to be able to make that happen is in that intelligent force, that creative energy that weaves in between us all is so fascinating. And I think when I first saw, I believe, Ken Wilber's Spectrum of Consciousness and Integral Spirituality, the kind of color chart of consciousness and the levels of consciousness that, from a bird's eye view, you could look at a human being on their own developmental journey and see them go from infrared to ultraviolet, that correspond and correlate to different perspectives and worldviews. And it's like the ultimate video game. He's like, which is so exciting once you find a framework that really shows you how you can wake up and what that, because it can be so esoteric and kind of this far off thing, but like it's such a real process from point to point.
Yeah.
I'll just pause because I can see you brimming.
Well, I'm just thinking of my wife, Nicole, and we sit around the kitchen table and she's like, God, like they don't even know about development. Like we don't even teach human development in our schools, right? And so then it can sound esoteric, but actually, as Ken, who's done this huge amount of research in one of his books, Integral Psychology, there were charts after charts after charts, basically showing, listen, all of these can be distilled into a developmental structure. And once you understand that developmental structure has like a fractal, it is based on perspective taking. So we could even take the journey, so to speak, through perspectives, if you wanted to, if that was interesting. But the dynamism of development is algorithmic, if you will, right? And once you appreciate that and understand that, and you understand the map, suddenly you can see the world in terms of colors or in terms of perspectives. You can understand development in terms of like seeing the culture wars that are happening and why they're happening developmentally. It helps the bodhisattva. It helps her understand the classroom that she's in and how to help all the beings who are in the different class levels, right? It's like suddenly waking up at high school and realizing that everybody in middle school and elementary school is in a slightly different grade. Right. And then if you want to help somebody, we'll work out what is their central operating principle at that level of development. So you can't really you can't stabilize and function as soul or as a bodhisattva without understanding development. It's not going to happen.
And it's going to be futile to try to speak to somebody at like a second or third density level with this like seventh dimensional kind of perspective. It's just
no, you just get burnt at the stake. If that's, typically what we like to say is like 2 stages. 1 stage above can be, can like cause some interest. 2 stages above, allergies.
Yeah.
Right? Would it be useful to kind of make a journey through these stages?
Yeah, I'd love to. So, I mean, there's many different frameworks of this, from spiral dynamics to these levels of consciousness that kind of color coordinate the developmental process. What I want to do is zoom out, take a bird's eye view. What are all the pieces of the pie of the developmental journey as well?
Right.
And then let's go through these different colors, because as somebody who's maybe more at an egocentric, conventional level of development, they're going to have, even if they have like an inner luminous state experience, they will correspond and maybe attach it to a religious figure or perspective in a certain way, versus somebody at maybe, a blue or purple consciousness, if you will have that and see it with more clarity in its true form in a way. Yeah. And so it's just so fascinating, because every experience that we're walking around to, we're seeing it through, metaphorically, these color tinted glasses that we have on of how we see things.
That's right.
That's right. As that quote that I love and repeat many times from Wayne Dyer, when we change the way we look at things, the things we look at change. And we change the way we look at things by changing who we are being for ourselves. So let's move let's go up this developmental journey.
Sure.
We'll kind of overview as well.
Okay, so high level view is, let's say, this planetary system has a number of levels of grades or initiations. And once you complete those grades, and just like our planet is like middle school, obviously, right? So even if you're like, well, I'm at the top, it's like, really, we're bottom dwellers. So that's helpful because, we don't want to get inflated, but it's also important that if you are reaching graduation, that you it's important that you recognize that you are, and it's also important that that we're able to find the spaces that those graduates, those near graduates, can actually say, hey guys, it's okay, before they leave and never come back again, so to speak.
Yeah, if we're middle schoolers,
right?
I think we're at the top of the mountain.
That's right.
It's not preschool either, right? But
no, it's not preschool.
This is Earth school. We came here to work our shit out through the reflection and mirrors of duality.
That's right. Well, let's just begin the journey, and I'm sure we'll kind of weave. So we can look at it also, which is helpful through perspective taking. So if you think of first person perspective is, let's say an infant doesn't even have first person perspective. They're kind of fused with everything. And as they're differentiating themselves from other, they become aware of I, right? Self-reflective capacity. And you'll notice that when a child finally sees themselves in a mirror, right? That is a developmental milestone. Before that, my son Bodhi, when he was 3 months, I used to sit on my lap when I was doing meditation interviews, and he would sit there and just drool and just look at the great beyond. I'd be like, yeah, you need to meditate like this, right? But 6 months later, when he saw himself in the mirror, then he's like, the self is there, right? So first person is really the birth of, if an adult is operating from that place, that's complete narcissism.
Yeah.
It's me, right?
An example of this that might be useful for the listeners too is at that pre-conventional stage of development. I've heard this example many times where you put a ball in between us. One has one half of it's red, the other half of it's blue. Mm-hmm. And if I'm sitting across from a baby who doesn't have that ability to take the role of other,
that's right.
If I show him both sides, right? Look, it's half of it's blue, half of it's red. If you just show him the red side, you say, what color are you seeing?
Red.
What color are they saying?
Red. That's right. Red.
Inability to take the role of other.
No other.
Yeah.
That's right. First person perspective.
Mm-hmm.
And so, we all begin there. Right? And then slowly what develops is second person perspective. Now, in that process, if we didn't have a history that we have, part of that being born would also being born into magical world. So children are still living in this kind of magical world which is alive with magic, and the trees are alive, and right, they're kind of living inside of a fairy tale, right? And as they slowly develop second person perspective, this is what we call in cognitive psychology concrete operational thinking. So what concrete operations means is you can finally process zeros and ones, black and white, in and out. So it's a level of cognition that it can't do anything than that. So this is what we would recognize as fundamentalist cognition, right? Like, are you in? Are you part of the in crowd? Or are you part of the out crowd, right? And as we go through this, it's important to recognize that we all have these operating systems still happening right now, right? So that second person perspective, it kind of matures into, the best of it is like the code, the true, what is good and what is bad, or my nation, right or wrong, or my team, or my religion, or wherever there's this very strong black and white way of thinking. And of course it can be extremely dangerous. And if we were to go and we were to discuss like empire on this planet, empire loves to manipulate to second person perspective, this level of cognition, because there's still a vast amount of people on this planet running those programs, and they can easily be manipulated. Because if you really, really like something and you really don't like something, you can manipulate somebody all around the board. And who manipulates them? Third person perspective, which is the birth of objectivity, right? So first person perspective, John. Second perspective, André. Is André with me or is he against me? Third person is like, there's something objective over there, and maybe you and I can actually agree about that, right? From that level of consciousness was birthed a whole world. Now we've seen this progression evolve in the last 12,000 years, but these cycles obviously repeat themselves in any civilizational cycle, if that makes sense. Like we begin and we go first, second, third. So this isn't just about modernity, but third person perspective we see in modernity. And if you look in the history of art in the West, suddenly in the Renaissance, the art pops a perspective, and suddenly there's like, you're looking into a painting and you can see perspective in the painting, right? Dark Ages, it's just flat, and then suddenly there's perspective, and they're drawing perspective into the painting. You're seeing there in art the birth of third person perspective, right? Of course, there were probably people before that, but the thing about the Renaissance is there was enough financing that you could begin to see all of the artifacts born out of that. Fourth person perspective is the birth of multicultural pluralism. Right? So what do we mean by that? We mean that since the last 100 years, and particularly since the 60s, fourth person perspective is the ability to see that third person perspective is lacking something significant. What's it lacking? It's lacking the perspective of the feminine. It's lacking the perspective of other cultures who do science. We've done third person perspective through a particular science. Well, how about Chinese science or Ayurvedic science, right? So fourth person perspective is inclusive. And it's what we see right now in the kind of a progressive woke movement, right, in our culture, in the left wing, right, which is we need to make sure that every single voice is heard. And of course, that's a necessary compensation for 500 years or even more of this third person kind of machinery that we've seen is so effective in basically harnessing, the Industrial Revolution and drawing upon, monetizing and breaking everything down into smaller pieces. So that's third person perspective, fourth person perspective. Fifth person perspective. Now, let me just say something that we can look at these perspectives and say, well, there's 1 and there's 1.5 and there's 2 and there's 2.5 and there's 3 and there's 3.5, right? There's something that's very important that happens just after fourth person perspective. We could call that 4.5. We could call it integral. But essentially, the understanding that there is a developmental ladder doesn't kick in till 4.5. What that means is prior to that, if you get the kind of traditionalists in a room with Wall Street executives who are running like mainstream CNN, like be all you can be code in the same room as kind of like crunchy progressives, right? Woke progressives, they're all going to look at each other and think that the other person is completely mad and needs to be like taken out, right? it's at the birth of the capacity for hierarchical thinking that appreciates all of those stages of development and begins to realize like, oh, I need to go back and I need to do some healing, because the second person perspective, when I was meant to be like integrating like a deep sense of connection with others, maybe I didn't, right? So the birth of like integral cognition, 4.5, is the ability to recognize the whole stack and recognize the value of every single one of these prior stages. If we were to use this in the language of the chakra system, 4.5 is when you like a dimension of the heart where the heart realizes like, oh, you know what? The solar plexus and the second chakra and the root chakra are all important. Wow, there's colors. Oh my gosh, there's colors up as well as down. So 4.5 is the beginning of a really grounded appreciation that has gone through all of these stages to get here, and then the recognition like, oh my gosh, wow. And it can begin to see the whole stack and appreciate development. Before that, it's not that you won't appreciate the great mystics, but you're going to kind of throw them out in space. And also there's a lot of mixing of what we call the pre-trans fallacy, meaning mixing like magical thinking with like transpersonal technology. Like just because something isn't rational doesn't mean that it's sacred.
Can you think of an example of that?
Okay, yeah. Well, first in terms of altered states, right? There are some altered states where it's like a regressive state because you're going to go into that state so that you can regress back to some childhood innocence, right? And feel your feelings and run around, take off your clothes and be completely free. Okay, that is a non-rational state. That isn't the same thing as the non-rational opening up of this non-conceptual valid cognition. Now you could say, well, both are completely spontaneous, and this goes back to what I was saying earlier. Well, yes, one is the jazz musician playing, and the other one is smashing on the keys, right? Now, don't get me wrong. I like to take my clothes off and run around as well, right? But to recognize that kind of freedom, right? That freedom, which is the freedom of the body, isn't necessarily the same thing as the freedom of soul. But what's happened in our culture is it's very easy for us to like merge the two.
Yeah.
Right? And we need both, right? But they're not the same thing, right? Is that a good example?
Yeah. I think a lot of what people would attribute to being free or freedom is like a kind of more immature, temporary access to something that is like is a feeling of freedom, yet it's within the context and confines of a lot of the shit you haven't looked at, for example, where you could actually arrive at a stage that sustains your freedom.
Okay, another good example would be psychedelics.
Yeah.
Okay, psychedelics will open up, but they can open up the ceiling, or they can open up the basement. Okay, and so how do you know, like, when you've had this amazing vision and some being communicated stuff, to you, how do you know that basically it wasn't just your own narcissism talking to you about how amazing you are?
Exactly.
Right?
Which is very real.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's nothing worse than getting stuck next to somebody telling you their ayahuasca trip, right? Because you're like, so, and so that's not to say anything negative about psychedelics. They open.
Yeah, they open the veil.
And they open the veil either direction, either trans or pre, but much more confusingly, both at the same time. Right? If you don't have a developmental understanding, you won't be able to purify and distill, which is why at a certain point, many of the traditions will leave the psychedelic work behind in favor of maybe a more precise approach. I think that might change as we evolve our appreciation of psychedelics. We'll be able to take them. I mean, the truth is if we if the sacred academy in the West hadn't been suppressed, we'd have had 2,000 years of psychedelics. And our alchemical elixirs would be, I mean, just amazingly refined, you know. Right now, I think it's like a hammer and a chisel. You know what I mean?
Yeah, which is still a pretty damn magical hammer and chisel.
Yeah.
But just on that note, because we have like accessing these altered states, like you said, both to the trans and pre, can open up the veil to the basement and the ceiling, which is very powerful.
Yep.
And it's useful for seeing and having a reference point of what's possible. But at the same time, it's like if there's me right here and the truth of who I am is over there, but there's a wall in between, the psychedelic or altered states, you know, moments can be like a trampoline to see that. Right. But as you jump up, you must come down, and building the stages of consciousness is like building a ladder to like
absolutely
to actually get there. And once you're there, then you're there, and you don't need to jump on a trampoline anymore unless you want to, just for the fun of it.
Yeah, for sure. Well, so we were at fourth person perspective.
4.5.
4.5. Right. Okay. Yes. So essentially 4.5 realizes development. 4 realizes context. That everything is socially constructed, right? Okay, like a good dose of kind of French postmodernism with a cigarette and a black coffee, right? That's kind of 4. A whole new tier of development opens up a fifth person perspective. A fifth person perspective, not only do you appreciate that things are socially constructed and that they are developmentally constructed, at fourth person perspective, you begin to realize...
Fifth person?
Fifth. Did I say for fourth?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Fifth person perspective, the mind begins to see. So remember, when we're saying perspectives, we're not talking about thinking. We're talking about seeing. Now that seeing can think, but it is really a seeing. Like it's how many cuts the diamond has, right? At fifth person perspective, the diamond has enough cuts to see that everything that we use in terms of language, all language is a construction. The whole thing. Now, what does that mean? It means that awareness begins to see through all of the structures into the deeper interconnected field. Fifth person perspective is the beginning of the soul awareness coming online. Now, to make things more difficult, you could have a great master, a great meditation master, who's at, let's say, sixth person perspective, and he's going for a pilgrimage, and he comes across a kindly goat herder who's sitting out, chilling, smoking his pipe, right? And the meditation master could teach this goat herder, who is kind of just like living in the village and developmentally not very sophisticated because doesn't need to be, right? It's not even third person perspective. He's just kind of smoking his pipe, and the great meditation master can say, okay, I want you to do this technique. Now, the goat herder would have never have came up with that technique himself. It's unlikely. However, he was introduced to the technique. So now we have this interesting thing is that he's been introduced with a technique, with a technology developed by somebody at sixth person perspective. He's ingested this psychotechnology and is running it. This is where we see a lot of the confusion, because you can run that technology, have experiences of, let's say, soul, but developmentally, your structure is actually not at that level structurally. What does that mean? It means you're going to interpret the whole state experience based on the level of development that you're at, right? Ideally, we want you to be interpreting the state experience at the level that that state comes from. So this is why, in some ways, meditation itself can be developmentally inappropriate. Like, there's more important lessons to be doing when when our kids are at preschool, we want them to be doing preschool stuff. When they're in middle school, we want them to be middle school. There's nothing worse than a precocious child who's been like listened to the wrong conversations and is like, in middle school and telling everybody else about like whatever it is, when really that isn't necessarily the lesson that needs to be learned at that stage.
Right. And it could fracture our consciousness perhaps at that stage too, because our eyes and energy gets put on to sight for this one area, which is, we talked in the Gilbert podcast about the energies of Ahriman and Luciferic impulses. And, in the East, there's more Luciferic impulses in terms of these early access to these spiritual states and experiences. Now, there's no value judgment on that, but if there's, like you're speaking to, there's these other developmental processes that haven't been focused on first, then you might be able to, and you see this with a lot of gurus that have woken up to the profound truth of who they are, but they still haven't cleaned up their own, psychodynamic stuff and childhood stuff. And so I feel like we often put this umbrella of like waking up is just like kind of everything, but it's like one aspect of it.
Yeah, waking up ideally, our friend Ken articulated this, this simple maxims, kind of waking up, growing up, cleaning up, opening up, showing up, and I always like to add fucking up because you know what I mean? That's really, there's a lot of that happening.
That's a good addition.
Right? The growing up process.
Before we go into this, because I do want to dive into this, was there anything else within the fifth, sixth person?
Well, yes. Yeah. So I think the first thing to say is essentially what the fifth, so that is opening up that whole tier of the soul, of non-conceptual valid cognition, where the hallmark of it is the recognition of the fabric of love as being like the fabric upon which all that information is flowing. So the intuitive information is flowing on love, if that makes sense. As that process, so in the beginning of that tier, this is where we can get into like closer. Some of the details of these dynamics, but essentially, because this will be speaking to many of your listeners. They're beginning to journey into that realm. So the beginning of that tier of soul, the tier of the bodhisattva, the experiences of that fundamental openness. So from the point of view of the mind, you're seeing through the structures. And then from the point of view of the heart, you're feeling that as like a deep intimacy with all beings. In the beginning, it's a passive process. What I mean is that to kind of have that state, it takes a lot of work to be able to calm the mind down and open things up to experience it. So your ego in some senses is passive. You have a meditation practice, right? After a certain amount of time, and the better the teaching and the better the teacher, the faster that time, because that time could be decades or months, right? I mean, the technology does matter. I think what's important for our friends to understand is that just as you and I and all of us took that journey from zero perspective to fourth person perspective through our educational system, if you went through the educational system, particularly recently, you will get to fourth person perspective at university. That is like guaranteed. It is scaffolded. It's a so it's not some kind of like mysterious process that we don't know anything about. It's the same thing up, if that makes sense. It's not a mysterious process. Even the term mysticism is a bit of a misnomer because it actually isn't a mystery. It's a science. So I'm saying that because as we move in to discuss these realms which might sound mystical, they're actually pretty precise from the point of view of the academy, from the visible college, if you will, from the kind of the adepts of the planetary dharma. This is not like vague. Yeah. So first kind of phase is somewhat passive, whether you're taking plant medicine or you're doing a meditation practice. As that new perspective is essentially wired in, so in terms of like the kind of the neuroplasticity to hold that way of looking at reality becomes solid, the next stage, which would be like a 4.5 stage, is that the mind, thinking mind, can now be fully operational whilst maintaining that experience of fundamental openness, right? So your identity is shifted to like soul identity, soul realization, but it's more than that, because now you can reintroduce the mind, and now the mind can start being informed by that field, and it can begin to organize itself and reveal itself. So the mind itself begins to become an expression of synchronicity. That's what we mean by intuition. As that matures, at that point you think that you're really hot shit. and you are hot shit. Because frankly, we're developmentally, we're talking probably like, 0.01% of the planetary population. But then what begins to dawn on the practitioner is that, oh, maybe I'm not alone here. Right? So if you can imagine, it would be the same thing way back down in like preschool, where like little Billy or little, Joanne learns how to talk and learns how to like move, and they're pretty hot shit. And then suddenly they go to the next classroom and like everybody's doing it. But before that, they were like, look at me. So that what happens is the soul begins to realize that it is joining what we would call the human hierarchy. That there is actually like to use a contemporary term, there is a organization that they kind of step into, or they begin to intuit that they're part of an organization. An organization, a hierarchy, a holarchy of advanced souls, if you will, of wisdom and compassion. But again, not advanced really compared to like some of the other galactic civilizations. So we can, you know what I mean? Like it's like advanced compared to maybe the majority of humanity.
Right.
And a lot of a lot of our listeners, perhaps who are already, some who are already engaged, already involved in that, part of the challenge is that because of this wetware, this body mind hasn't been initiated. And we can talk about the need for building a new initiatory system. Because of that, your remembrance between functioning within a department of that organization in the dream state and what you're doing in the awake state is not the transference of information because of the kind of the pineal atrophy, if that makes sense, and the lack of kind of DMT in the system. The ability to carry over that information from one dimension to another dimension is weak. And this is actually a major problem that we have right now with many people. That level of initiation is not knowing that they're part of something, but they are. Like a good example, my wife, Nicole, I forget what, the first, it was a few years back, it was one of those elections where people were like, oh my God, what is going to happen? And she got so concerned that she started lucid dreaming, and then went through a whole cycle where she was with a group and they would go to different places on the planet, right? The White House or the Sudan, and essentially like provide kind of like off-ground support. The truth is that if that would be your motivation in the waking state, then it's also what's happening in the dream state, which is more connected to the kind of that much larger ecosystem of soul. But because the physical body hasn't been initiated, because of the chemistry of this body, we're not able to remember. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And that's why the initiatory systems were so important, because they were helped to kind of like support the soul, the body and the personality, the soul and the personality integrating. So that's sixth person perspective. Now, just so you know, in terms of, let's say, the advanced meditation systems, that is maybe only 2/3 of the way up the mountain. I don't know if it's, talking about those more rarefied kind of clear light states. I don't know how useful it is, so to speak, but just recognize that there are further grades. I mean, what we're talking about now is the territory that probably nearly everybody who's listening in this lifetime, that is like the territory that is like, it's also the territory that's really needed, so to speak, because if we can build a new initiatory system that really takes people through those stages into sacred world and initiates their chemistry so that we actually can see sacred world again, that's enough to reverse the wheel and put us in the, heading in the right direction.